and you're listening to WBCM.
Coming up high, way back yonder in Tennessee, Billy's the convict south. They worked them in the coal mines against free labor stout. Free labor rebelled against it too, and it took some time. But while the leaf was in effect, they made them rise and shine. Oh, buddy, won't you roll down the line? Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Yonder come my darling, coming down the line. Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Yonder come my darling, coming down the line. Every Monday morning, they've got 'em out on time. March them down to Lone Rock, said to look into that mine. March you down to Lone Rock, said to look into that hole. Well, as word the captain say, you'd better get your coal. Oh, buddy, won't you roll down the line? Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Yonder come my darling, coming down the line. Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Yonder come my darling, coming down the line. The beans they are half done, the bread is not so well. The meat it is burnt up and the coffee is black as heck. But when you get your task done, you're glad to come to call. For anything you can get to eat, it tastes good done all raw. Oh, buddy, won't you roll down the line? Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Yonder come my darling, coming down the line. Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Yonder come my darling, coming down the line. The bank boss is a hard man, a man you all know well. And if you don't get your task done, he's going to give you hallelujah. Carry you to the stock gate, as long the floor you'll fall. Very next time the ball on you, you bet you'll have your coal. Oh, buddy, won't you roll down the line? Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Yonder come my darling, coming down the line. Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Buddy, won't you roll down the line? Yonder come my darling, coming down the line.
Broadcasting from the birthplace of country music, this is WBCM LP Bristol.
We go down to the pound, just have a little fun. You better have your $15 when the policeman comes. Oh, sweet mama, daddy's got them deep Bella blues. Oh, sweet mama, daddy's got them deep Bella blues.
7 long years. And if he's gone for 7 years long.
So hello, everyone, and welcome to the birthplace of country music tonight. We're glad to see you here with us. And we're excited that we have Lee Bidgood with us here tonight to talk to us about musical traditions, the Global String Band, and as you can see, sharing quite a lot of music with us, so that's an extra treat. I'm Renee Rogers. I'm the museum director here at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. My colleague Sam Turner is in the back. Sam Parker, in fact. I don't know where that came from, is running tech. And before we get started, though, I just have a few housekeeping details for those of you who might not have been here before. If you need to leave to go to the restroom, they are down the hall and to the left here. The front of the museum will be locked, so the doors that you came in will be locked probably in the next 15 minutes. So if you do need to leave early, you can exit out the side door, which is just right outside of out of the Performance Theater out onto Moore Street. We will have time for questions afterwards, so please, if you have anything that you want to ask Lee, I'll bring the mic around and you can ask him some questions. Do wait for the mic to come to you, though, because we want to be sure our viewers on YouTube, because we are also streaming this live, can hear the question. And then there will be a survey sent out afterwards, and if you get that, it's great. It's really helpful to send that back to us, and it really helps us with our programming. And then finally, please consider sharing a donation after tonight's program, either here in our donation jar at the front or through a link in the chat for those of you who are with us on YouTube. The museum offers mostly free or low-cost programming to our community, and anything you give helps us to continue to create programs like this one and to make them accessible to the public. Before we head over to Lee and let him take over for the night, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about him. Lee Bidgood's research on Czech bluegrass has been supported by 2 Fulbright grants and inspired the documentary film Banjo Romantica that was released in 2015, as well as the book Czech Bluegrass, Notes from the Heart of Europe from 2017. An early member of the Steep Canyon Rangers and Big Fat Gap, Lee plays bluegrass, old time, and early musics on fiddle, mandolin, viola, and viola da gamba. As professor in East Tennessee State University's Department of Appalachian Studies, he teaches courses in ethnomusicology and bluegrass, old time and roots music studies, leads a mandolin orchestra and global string band, and directs the Institute for Appalachian Music and Culture. He also was on the original content team for the museum. Welcome, Lee. We're really glad to have you with us, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Renee. It's an honor to be here. It's been a little while. I think last time we were here with the Mandolin Orchestra a while ago. I may have only had one child at that point. It's always just so fun to be here. There's so much history and so many connections in this building and in the history of the movement that brought this institution into being. And also because you're all here. I'm thinking about the title of our program, Bluegrass, Old Time, and Roots Music, right? That has something to do with connections. I'm just curious if y'all can call out, and I'll repeat here. I know we want to make sure they go into the mic. What are some associations that y'all have with roots music, or just roots in general? The Carter family around here, we definitely think of them. Or yeah, it could be direct or specific or abstract. What are other things that y'all think of when we think of that idea of roots? Grandfather singing on the front porch. Absolutely. Anyone else? Yeah.
I grew up in rural northern New York, and it's surprising to go listen to music here, and I recognize the music. The words might be different than
Yeah.
I grew up with, or there's a little bit of variation, but it has such similarity, the Adirondack Mountains.
Okay, yeah. So even up in New York State, in the Adirondack Mountains, there are similarities to the things that you hear around here. So we have that idea of a common roots, things that are shared. We have something that is as distinct as your own family tree, your own relatives, something that is very much tied to a specific place. And we have the Carter family, right? We have sound, we have all that idea of family connection. I think roots, Alex Haley, that's one association that's very common with that term, is that idea of legacy, of ideas, but also DNA of people. So when we think about vernacular music around here, a lot of the music that is celebrated and interpreted and explained here in this museum are these stringed instruments. I've just thrown them all over the floor here so we could look at them if you ever get bored during this evening. So a lot of the music that we deal here is string music, not all of it. But I've brought a bunch that I could fit. I did not bring the bass, but I'm going to talk about it in a little bit. But when we think of the music that belongs in and around this region, as the orientation film upstairs says, we often think of it as bound to place, bound to Bristol. But we can also think about all these instruments and the people who use them as being connected to other places. And that's kind of where I want to go tonight. And the global string band class that I've developed in the larger project of the global string band reminds us that we're not only in this music connecting to here and a certain place, but also to various histories and to other places and people. So as promised, I want to start with a bass, but I'm going to start with the littlest one. So as I was telling some people before, this is a viol. You may have heard of something like a bass viol, if you remember that scene, the charming scene of music making at the beginning of The Hobbit by Tolkien. Some of the dwarves out of somewhere pull out some bass viols and play along with Thorin on his golden harp and everything. So this is a treble viol. So this is the smallest version of what we often call the viola da gamba family. That's the Italian word, and it clarifies that you're supposed to hold it with your legs. So you hold it kind of like a cello, but there's no end pin. So you got to hold really carefully. So this kind of instrument is related to a lot of other instruments from way back. I'm not going to be too specific here. I'm going to gesture a little bit. If you have specific questions, we can get into that later. But, in the 1500s and the 1600s, some earlier, some later, these instruments were really common in Italy. And it was a whole family of instruments that were common in the most refined corners of Europe. So in courts or noble houses, you would have this family of instruments in a time when what was becoming the violin at that time was very uncouth. It was more used for dancing down at the tavern or something. If you really if you wanted class, this was the way to go. But it shares a lot of characteristics with the present day big bass that we have. And there were large versions of this as well. It has a flat back. You can see it's got, sound holes are a little different. But the strings are, for the most part, a fourth apart, similar to a guitar or to the present day double bass. So our bass has its roots in this little instrument of different sizes. But there's one thing that I love about the bass, and I wanted to start with this, because the basses that were used in string band music in this part of the country, going back a while, I think about it. If you had a really expensive carved top instrument, the solid top instrument, first of all, that would be really expensive, and no one around here would have had one. And also, you wouldn't have wanted to drag it anywhere. I wouldn't have dragged it on top of my carriage from Johnson City to come up here, It was not until the 1930s, as far as I can tell, that folks were making and selling instruments that were much more accessible. Can y'all guess what was the material that made this possible? Plywood, right? So people have been gluing together veneers of wood for quite a while. I saw patents in the 19th century dealing with plywood and various discussions of it early on. But the K company, Epiphone company, started making basses in the 1930s. And all of a sudden, you could have a stringed instrument at that depth of sound that didn't cost a fortune and which wasn't going to wig out if you took it with you if you were touring around somewhere. And so the bass as we know it now is a combination of a very old and a very new process. So I'd like to think about it because it's got a lot of these sort of contradictions and various cross currents in its history. Now, we're going to go from the big one to the little one. I'm going to go to the fiddle, and we are going to go to my first slide. Let's see how it goes. Ooh. Yeah. All right, Sam's going to help us out. Okay. Or I can just indicate. There's not that many of them, Sam. Whatever works. There you go. All right, so here you can see this is a version of a bass that was made out on the Cumberland Plateau in La Follette. You can see that in the background. And also with Howard Armstrong, who's a fiddle player. So this is our transition. If you haven't heard Howard Armstrong, check him out. Louie Bluey, it'll blow your mind. So I'm a fiddle player myself, and that's how I started with music. And it's only recently that I've been digging back more into the longer history of the violin and the fiddle. And Sam, if you go to the next one, we can take a step back to 1651, which is the first edition of this particular thing. There's a longer history, as I was saying, to various European stringed instruments. But with this publication, I can see a lot of the connections, a lot of the ingredients that we have with our vernacular string band music in the United States in the tunes that were played, but also in what they were used for, which is dancing. So in the English Dancing Master that was published in London by this guy, John Playford, we can see, you can find there's a lot of resources about the English Dancing Master if you're curious online. You can see a lot of the dances, the steps, the forms that are outlined in there. So you could buy this book and you could have the tunes and the dances that went together. Many of these are long ways, sort of like a contradance, or some are square. So it has, we have in the United States a lot of elements that we took from the traditions of country dancing that were going on in England and other parts of Europe. Of course, the diversity of elements that came together into solo and social dance in Southern Appalachia are really diverse. And Phil Jamison's book, whose title is really awesome, and I can't remember it right now, I didn't write it down, but Phil Jamison is a professor from... No, it's Southern squares and dancing. And anyhow, but he really outlines a lot of the diversity of European elements that come into the square dancing and solo dancing that we know around here, but also the important African American elements that came in, including calling. His argument is that the idea of calling a dance is one that has African roots, because folks in Europe would have been checking up on these kind of things or taking lessons, and they would already know the dances. For instance, if you've ever watched Pride and Prejudice or something, Mr. Darcy and all the ladies and gents are all then, no one's telling them what to do, right? There was the expectation, even at a lower social class, that you would know the dances or be able to dance them without prompting. So when European visitors came to the United States, they were kind of shocked that someone was shouting at everyone and telling them how to dance. But that was a necessary part of life. If you wanted to have a dance and you had someone who's immigrated from Germany or France or Scotland or England, and you had native folks, you had enslaved or free people of color of various kinds, the caller made it happen. So that technology, it was an African cultural, social technology that made social dancing work, especially in a place, the riverine frontier or up here in the mountain frontier. So that just really interesting histories of the music and also of the dance. So connected with the fiddle, you could go to the next one, Sam. We have the artifact of the fiddle, which has been mostly unchanged for a long time. It's seen some changes. They have these little tuners at the bottom, maybe a chin rest. We got this fancy cushy thing so that my tender bones on my shoulder and collarbone don't get creased. But it's mostly stayed the same. And we can look at violins that were produced in Europe or violins that were produced here or fiddles. I'm going to skip over the jokes about what's a fiddle and what's a violin. But I'm going to take one of those jokes. The punchline is, it's all in how you play it. And one of the really important contributions that enslaved African people or people of African origin made to this kind of vernacular string band music was how they played the fiddle. And looking back, you can see many reports, and Phil Jameson has a lot in his book, because a lot of dances were accompanied by African or African American people. And at some point, that term comes into more focus through the 19th century. But this is an advertisement from 1778 for someone who was seeking a person that they had enslaved and who had emancipated themselves. And he took his fiddle and fife with him, both of which would have been used for dancing. So you think about it, if you were in the 18th century and you wanted to have a dance, you had to either purchase your labor to provide the music, or get your kids to learn, right? Or some people who had a certain level of wealth could purchase a person to do that. Look, that's $100 reward in 1778. That's a lot of money. So the value of what musicians like this person brought to the music sphere and to dances must have been really substantial. And all of I'm not going to say all, but the vast majority of the folks like the Carter family, like Jimmy Rogers, like Hank Williams, like Bill Monroe, all point back to mentors or models that were black, that really deeply informed how they played their music. And that's a really big part of this history. So the fiddle looks the same, but it's all in how you play it. I'm sort of bi-musical myself. I came up doing the classical kind of thing, but I've played fiddle since I was less than 10 as well. So I know what it is to play differently on one side of the line or the other. And I know if it, so that's something that I've seen in my own history that emphasizes to me how important it is how you play it. And I'm going to get to that later. The fiddle has a role to play after a while. And I'm going to switch to the banjo, and I'm going to put this mic down and switch to the other one. So for the bonus points, anyone know the tune? Cumberland Gap. Jim, you get all the bonus points so far. We'll divide some up later. So many people use the term for the banjo. Okay. Some people call it America's instrument, which that's a while ago that there was a book that came out the early 2000s that used that title, and that term has been around. I don't know if I were going to come up with what is America's instrument. But it's definitely a really important and, a significant instrument in American history and in American popular music and vernacular music. So for most 50 years or more now, we've been slowly rediscovering that important roots from the banjo go back to Africa. And I think it's really important to know that the banjo, if we're going to be really specific, is not an African instrument, however. It really is an American instrument, or perhaps an African-American instrument. And I want to tell you why. So I was here for the banjo gathering here not too long ago, and Christina Gaddy, Pete Ross, they're among a group of folks who are really finding out a lot about the history of the banjo, and not just on the mainland here, and not just in connection to various parts of West Africa, but in the Caribbean. And if you may know that the Middle Passage that brought enslaved people over here to this hemisphere did not, for the most part, bring them to the mainland up here, but to various parts of the Caribbean. So there were folks there from all different backgrounds and situations, languages, cultures, religious, ceremonial beliefs and practices thrown together in a situation of enslavement in the Caribbean. We're going to bracket that and say that that's just a terrible situation that I can't imagine. In the middle of that terrible situation, folks put together their memories of instruments that they had used and known and played back in the place where their roots were before they were uprooted, and found things about them that they could use to make them. And Sam, if you go to the next slide, you can see this is a drawing from the 1770s by a gentleman named Hans Sloane. He was a physician sent to the island of Jamaica to take care of the colonial governor there, and I think apparently died around the time he got there. So he didn't have much to do, so he went around and learned about what was going on, and one thing he did was collect things in drawings and in actual form, including some of these instruments which really clearly seem to connect with this kind of instrument. And I think these were listed as a banza, B-A-N-Z-A, and there have been some instruments that have been found in European museum collections that look very much like that instrument there, front and center. You can see there's things that are very connected. We have the skin head. We have the strings that rest on a bridge that rests on that head, the tuning pegs at the top. The whole question of the short string is more complicated, and we don't have to get into that if we don't want to tonight. But I think the pattern of the banjo being made, like the banjo being something that is made out of effectively nothing. It's made from an idea and what you have around you. I was talking with some students yesterday in the Reese Museum at ETSU, and there's a banjo on the wall from not too far from us, I think over in Western North Carolina. And the word is that this particular builder would make the skin of his banjos from groundhogs. And it's all just local wood. He would turn his own pegs, continuing that tradition of making something out of nothing, or what you found around you. Gourds, exactly. You got to grow them. Yeah, absolutely. And then later, of course, folks here on the mainland, the instrument proved very popular, and it started to have more in common with a drum. And there's more to that story. It started to get a lot heavier and they get even heavier than this one. But the banjo is a reminder of, it has a very clear multinational story, right? Just like the fiddle and the bass. So we need to move on because we're making our way through all these, but we got some more to go. Sam, if you go to the next slide. Perfect. Oops, sorry. Now, the mandolin made its stage debut in the United States under false pretenses. So, hang on. There was this performer named Carlos Curti, and I just couldn't find as good an image as this. This one was just too good not to use. This is a different group. But Carlos Curti had a group that he billed as the Spanish students. There were a whole lot of Spanish students around this period of time. It clearly was something that was bringing people to your theater because there were a lot of different Spanish students in a lot of different places. So through the 19th century, through the second half of the 19th century, folks had gotten wind of this cool instrument from down in Italy. Most of the instruments in that time had this shape, right? They had the bowl back, sort of like a lute or the oud or other instruments of that type. So there were various instruments of that kind in Italy. 1600s, 1700s, and then by the 19th century, they had kind of solidified into one specific form, the one from Naples. So the Neapolitan mandolin kind of competed with the Roman mandolin for a while, but the Neapolitan proved to be the most popular. And it was really popular in Italy. Queen Margherita had her own Circolo Mandolinistico, and there were pieces dedicated to her for mandolin groups. And then there were groups, mandolin quartets, or other chamber groups, or maybe things more towards orchestras that were playing through the 19th century. And there were these groups of Spanish students, apparently, in Spain, at actual Spain universities, that used to wear dramatic black costumes and play fretted instruments. But they were not mandolins. For the most part, they were bandurias, which was actually an Iberian plucked instrument. And these look a little bit more like bandurias. It's a little unclear. Some of these people look a little odd, don't they? The proportions and so on. But the Spanish students that Curti put together were all Italian. And so when he was touring around in the United States, they were all playing mandolins, advertising themselves as the Spanish students, kind of banking on this fad for these dramatically dressed Spanish students. He also went on to be really important in Mexican regional music as well, but that's another story. So Carlos Curti brings this fad. He also eventually wrote a well-regarded method for how to play the mandolin. And so the mandolin eventually became a huge fad here circa 1900. Sam, if you go to the next one, you can see there was a whole industry of publications like the cadenza, which shows that this was not just about the mandolin. You can see that we call it the BMG movement, the banjo, mandolin, guitar movement. That's a term that's often used for all these plucked instruments that were very common around that period of time. But also the mandolin, guitar, banjo, zither, harp, and piano. Just all these sort of parlor instruments as the Industrial Revolution really hit its stride, and we start to see a middle class develop that had leisure time and money to buy fancy trinkets like this and to have a nice parlor to stash them all in, and then to host soirees and tea parties and things like that for people to come over and enjoy them, and money to purchase sheet music and to have lessons, and then to join a mandolin orchestra or a banjo orchestra or club or something like that. Universities start to see, it's been really interesting over the years to look at yearbooks and see if you're a yearbook from 1900 to 1920, it's likely that there's somewhere in there a picture of some students in there holding a bunch of fretted instruments together. Really interesting time when these instruments were really permeating the culture, especially in that middle class environment. And the Gibson Company of Kalamazoo, eventually, was something that came from the work of this kind of eccentric guy named Orville Gibson. And he was seeing mandolins that have this bowl back, as we call it. And he thought, well, if I were going to make it more like an orchestral European stringed instrument, what if I built a mandolin using the construction techniques of a violin? So like a violin, and unlike a viol, he proposed that we take a larger chunk of wood and carve the top and back, producing what we could now consider the American mandolin, which is very different from that European, the Neapolitan bowl-back mandolin. And I apologize, I have a Gibson mandolin, and I couldn't bring it. It was at school. But this is a Martin mandolin that it can stand in. But it has that same design. And the Gibson Company was really instrumental, not only in producing these instruments, but also in convincing people that it was wholesome and edifying to gather in small groups to play them. And they developed a network of promoters / teachers / organizers to market these things around and to teach groups of people to play them. So they were very effective at mobilizing in that way. So there's more history to that. It's really, I find it really fascinating. Very popular around that time. And they were also making things like harp guitars. If you go upstairs, there's the harp guitar in the case, and so many things were sold through that network and developed and encouraged through those teachers. All right, but for me, the mandolin orchestra was really, the idea of a mandolin orchestra was really instrumental in getting me towards this global string band idea. So we'll zoom back in history. If you go to the next slide, Sam, this is an album that we just released recently. It's material that was recorded in 2017 with Jim Miller on the mandocello, which is the lowered voice, the almost lowest voiced member of the mandolin family. And so as a group, I was trying to find interesting things for us to do. There was a whole lot of material sitting around from all these early 20th century groups and all sorts of stuff. We played Over the Waves by Juventino Rosas. We were playing an imitation of a brass band. All these things that really just bring you back to that time period. But I was also inspired to, as we got deeper into it, think about all the different connections. We did some tango repertory one year, which was really fun. We did, we started to do, for some reason I was working with some partners, and we performed at the Corazon Latino Festival, and we did a lot of Latin American music. And so this record has a lot of things from that whole project. And that's kind of what led me into this, well, what if we just had a group that was not just mandolins and would explore this global repertory? So along the way, we made this album. So could you play just for a minute or so, you don't have to have the whole track. Ooh, the fade out too. Thanks. So that was a song called Noites Cariocas, which is Brazilian, a piece composed by Jacob de Bandolim. His real name was Jacob Bittencourt, but he was associated through his name with the bandolim, which is a Brazilian version of the mandolin. And it's part of this style of music called choro, which originated in the early 20th century. It's a fascinating parallel to bluegrass. Choro, Brazilian choro and United States bluegrass are a really interesting parallel. Choro, if you're interested in, and it's a really cool style that has a lot of historical characteristics that it shares with bluegrass. But the mandolin in itself was, the orchestra gave us a lot of chances to explore some of these things. For instance, I'll give you all, could we all just count to 7 together? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What if we were to count to 7 again and again and again? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2. Okay, so Jim knows where we're going. One of the places that we went was to explore Balkan music, and one of the things I did in this group was to challenge students to play things that they had never played before. For instance, to play a piece where the time signature was in 7, and Balkan dances sometimes are in 7 or 11, which I still haven't gotten my head around. But so here, I'll play a little bit of a piece that we recorded and that I've taught to students over the year, because it challenges them to kind of get a little outside of the meters that we usually play in. That really will make your hair stand sideways for a little bit the first time you start getting into it. But Jim, it worked out, right? Right. Yeah, we got to it. So that's been I think the technical side of this has been really exciting, and it's something that I think the students really take on. A lot of the students in our Bluegrass Old Time and Roots Music Study program, they're ready to pick, and having a challenge like this can sometimes give them a place to stretch out and work in a new way. So time went on, and I was awarded a Fulbright grant to work in the Czech Republic in 2018, 2019. And that spring in 2019, I decided to give this a try. So I had a chance to myself stretch out a little bit and try something new. So I came up with this name, the Global String Band, recruited some folks and worked with students at Charles University in Prague. And we ran this class where half of it would be to learn about the cultural context of various string band traditions, kind of like I'm doing tonight. And then the other half would be to play them, try and play them. And I had the benefit of working with a lot of guest artists. It's great to be in a European capital city. There's a lot of folks just milling around there. And in the university as well, through an exchange, Aileen Delane was there, an Irish scholar of Irish trad music. And she led us in thinking about some ways that we feel at home in music, or the ways that music and how it sounds, how it's written, how it's performed, can help us to feel at home in a place. And that's one of the themes that really made an impression on me. And that's one of the themes that I've tried to keep weaving into this project as it continues. Because I think this music is about home, where you feel connected, how you feel rooted in a place or a situation. I think a lot of that's one of the things that I see as common in a lot of these musics we look at, that they help reinforce or create a sense of belonging and of home. So let me just get the guitar and talk about it a little bit after I play it. I'll probably have to tune it too, but that goes without saying, right? That was a tune called Trouble on the Mind, or Trouble on My Mind, that comes from John Salyer, Kentucky fiddle player. Now, you might, if you're a guitar player, I know there's some guitar players in the audience, you might notice I've got my top E string, lowest pitched E string, down a notch. Now, why am I playing an Appalachian fiddle tune with a tuning strategy that is often connected with a gentleman named John Doyle, who was born in Ireland? Get this, though. He currently resides in Asheville, North Carolina, just down the road. So I grew up in the 1990s hearing this band called Solas, which were hitting the charts for Irish trad music, even here in the United States. And the way that he played the guitar really made an impact on me. And so over the years, I've tried, 5 minutes at a time here and there over the decades to figure out what was going on with that. It really excited me, as it did a lot of other people who play this instrument. And that just, when I was stepping back, prepping for this to think about it, I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? The guitar really is a global instrument. It has this reach that goes in all these different places. And as in my story, there's all these places where guitar music and the ways we play it go from here to there and back again. Sam, if we go to the next one, it's guitar time. Look at this. So where is the guitar from? Where do we often think of it coming from? Right? In the Czech Republic, people often call a nylon strung guitar a španělka, a Spanish guitar. That is true, and we can go back to the 11th century. This is from the 1300s. This is an illustration from the Cantigas de Santa Maria with two kinds of guitarra. On the left, we have one that's the Latina guitar, and the one on the right is a moresca, or a Moorish guitar. So in that period of time, the different kinds of guitars reflected the religious and cultural diversity of the Iberian Peninsula at the time. And eventually, we have something like in the middle, we have the Baroque guitar. There without any frets. That looks like an adventure to play, doesn't it? That's made by Joachim Thielke, who also made splendid viola da gambas. Amazing instruments. I got to play one time, and I didn't wash my hands for a week. Really ornate. And then we have things on the right-hand side. This is an instrument by Johannes Stauffer, who was making guitars in Vienna through the 1800s, the first half of the 1800s. And let's let's see, I don't want to say things wrong. I'm actually not a guitar player, so I'm imitating a guitar player right now. So Stauffer lived from 1778 to 1853, and it was sort of in the middle of his life that we had another character show up, who is Christian Friedrich Martin, and the company that made this guitar eventually came from his work. But he had some hometown mix-ups after he came home to Mark Neukirchen in Germany from his apprenticeship with Stauffer, and that resulted in him leaving and coming to the United States, to New York, and then to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where in 1833 he eventually founded this company that really informed the way that guitars are built all around the world. So, I wonder if he hadn't gotten the cabinet makers or the violin makers guild. It's a guild issue. He was in the cabinet makers guild. The violin makers guild didn't want him making instruments. It was one of those things. If that hadn't happened, how would have our music history? Well, yeah, but I think guilds, it was like even more. I think it was more intense. So he ends up in the United States, and that leads to our next chapter, where we're going to go from Germany to the United States to Hawaii. So after Hawaii was annexed, taken over by the United States, Hawaiian musicians were often unable to remain in Hawaii. Some of them, historians tell us, were forced to leave because they were Hawaiian patriots and were not allowed to stay there. So they were exiled. So a lot of them went, ironically, to the United States, where they made their living touring as musicians, with circuses. There's been, John Troutman has done some interesting work on this and did a big book, which is fascinating. He finds connections between Hawaiian musicians and the blues, and he makes some really compelling, interesting arguments about the origins of slide guitar, which we don't have to talk about now, but I want to talk about the shape of the guitar. So there was this one particular musician named Mekia Kealakai, who led a band that toured the United States in 1915, and he found he needed a bigger guitar, which some of us might, be sympathetic with. You need to be louder. I feel like I need a bigger guitar to yell at my kids or something, but they were very successful. They did not have any amplification. So like many people during that period of time, he was seeking to find a way to acoustically increase the sound that he could produce. And so he wrote to Martin, and he said, I need a bigger guitar so that I can make more sound. And they did. Apparently he was one of just a handful of people by that period of time that the Martin Company had made a specific size of instrument for. And interestingly enough, this is a reproduction here. This style of a guitar, slightly modified, was what became known as the Dreadnought, and marketed, I think started in 1916 by the Martin Company, named after a class of battleship, because it was the biggest thing. So the Dreadnought was the biggest guitar. I think that shows how dramatic the guitar was in terms of size, bigger than the parlor styles that people were used to having. But now people were professionals, and they needed, high caliber guitars. So that Dreadnought shape, in some ways, was inspired by this Hawaiian musician and his professional needs touring the States. And now the Dreadnought is one of the most common instrument shapes all over the world, followed by, perhaps, the ukulele. And you might ask, well, Lee, how does the ukulele fit in? I'm so glad that you asked, because it has a really fascinating story too. The ukulele we think of as a Hawaiian instrument, and it has a Hawaiian name, and it's played by a lot of people in Hawaii, and a lot of people who have like pseudo-Hawaiian outfits on, but it has its origins in Portuguese immigrants who came to work in the pineapple fields and other agricultural work from Madeira, the Azores, and Cape Verde. And in the end of the 1800s, we see the arrival of these folks there, and soon after we start hearing about the instruments that they're making. And it doesn't take too long before the instrument that comes from those immigrants becomes very neatly and explicitly a Hawaiian instrument. And then there's this Hawaiian fad that we have from this guy and his compatriots who are touring all over the country. And then we have Jimmy Rogers sing everybody does it in Hawaii. And he's wearing a lei and holding a steel guitar like that guy was. So this fad for Hawaiian instrument, for Hawaiian music and the ukulele and this way of playing the guitar that sounds all slidey, the steel guitar technique, are a really huge part of country music. Cowan Powers and family, they were using the ukulele, maybe a uke banjo, and their recordings in the 1920s. They're from southwestern Virginia. So I'll give you one more. This is dizzying. I just have one more instrument left, so we can wrap it up. And this is a more recent discovery of mine, or not a discovery, just something I learned about more recently. This is called a harana. Now, interestingly, you might think, oh, well, Lee, that kind of looks like that Baroque guitar that you showed earlier, just not as fancy, and it has frets. And it kind of does. And Julio Coro, the man who made this instrument, told a story, kind of like a myth story that kind of proposes some things that might have happened. So he told us to imagine indigenous people seeing Spaniards land on the east coast of the Mexican peninsula, a place that's now called Veracruz. And the people there, the indigenous folks, thinking, man, that's a cool instrument. I want to make one like that. So I can sympathize with that, right? Except they did not make it like folks in Europe were making guitars. They made it like a canoe. They took a solid piece of wood and hollowed it out and then put a top on it. Which is, that's kind of important because it's a tropical climate. An instrument really, you'd have a hard time keeping a European-style guitar going on without a whole lot of high-powered glue. So the harana marks that colonial encounter moment in music and in an instrument form that's really interesting. You can come look afterwards, you can see it's just one continuous piece of wood. So the harana is used in the son jarocho style of music and in the fandango, which is a mix of dance and music. And it's been really fun to use these instruments. I wrote a grant and now bought a whole bunch of these instruments from Julio. He was able to come and visit with our students and teach them how to use these, and we've kept in touch over the years. So this is a fun way to concretely, with a different style of musical instrument, get our students at ETSU to connect with different styles of string band music and also with dance and singing. So I'll give you a sample of this, and then maybe we can have some questions. Oh, Jim, you had to ask. It's got an octave on the outside. It's G's, and then it's my dog has fleas. Yeah, that's how I think it's. It's C and then G's in octaves. Yeah, and I wonder about that. I've thought that myself, and I haven't done the research to find out about how the tunings might be related. Then there's E, and then A, and then G. Yeah, it's kind of a jazzy chord there. So it's my hope that these instruments, if we think about them And the projects like the one I'm trying out with the Global String Band can help us to identify and celebrate musical and cultural commonalities and increase understanding across the various borders that might otherwise divide us. So curious to hear what y'all think, and if you have any questions, I'm glad to take them.
Get the mic.
All right.
Does anyone have a question to start us off?
I'm glad, Jim, you were free to ask your questions during that. I'm glad we got some out of the way. Glad to take them now if you have any more. Thanks.
Well, I have a quick question to
Please.
start us off. This has been fascinating, Lee. I've enjoyed this so much. Took loads of pictures, have lots of questions
Okay.
for later in our lives. But what sort of prompted you specifically to start this project in the first place? I mean, I know that the sort of connections of instruments to wider understanding of the world is for me, very interesting. But what sort of prompted you to start this project in the first place?
Well, you mentioned my work in the Czech Republic, and so I had already a global kind of attention, and I got to know people in the Czech Republic who were playing bluegrass music and who are also creating musical instruments for bluegrass music players. People like Jarda Prucha, who makes banjos, like Jason Davis, if you know, who plays for bands around here, he plays a Prucha banjo. And Prucha-made parts are now supplied to many people who are buying spare banjo parts. They're made in the Czech Republic. So I knew about this global trade, and so I had that idea of that global circulation of ideas and instruments. And then one of my graduate assistants, we were equipping him to go out and do some outreach with high school. And we got to talking about the different programs we could do for a school audience. And we came across something like this, maybe a really scaled down version of this. And that was the first time I tried to program something like this. And so it's just always been in my head. And then with the mandolin orchestra, we just kind of started going in that direction. And then when I came back, I tried it out, and I wasn't sure where it was going to go. Came back in 2019 in the fall, and Trey Wellington, who was a student at the time, came to me in my office. He said, "Lee, I just thought you would be someone who would be into this. I would like to have one of our bands at ETSU concentrate on music from around the world. Would you be the leader for that and work with some of us, with Josiah Nelson and some other people, good musicians?" And I said, "Yes, sure, that'd be great." So it just kind of happened, and it's grown out of these roots and then with student interest over the years.
Yeah, I can definitely see how great this would also be for K through 12 students, just because it gives them a wider understanding of all sorts of things: immigration, enslavement of peoples, trade, etc. But you also said at the end of your talk about how important it was to sort of look at this as a way to connect in the middle of what can often feel like a very divided world.
Yeah.
Within the sort of microcosm of the students that you've been doing this at ETSU, have you seen that happening, those connections being made? And
That's an interesting question. I'll have to think about that. Yeah,
I didn't mean to stump you.
No, it's been interesting to have, our program at ETSU. In the past, I saw statistics. We have the largest percentage of out-of-state students at ETSU. So we have a lot of people who come to ETSU to be part of this program. They're not just going to their regional university. Like they're making a move. Like Chris Trulson did. He came here from Colorado, Chicago, right? People come here because it's a center to do this and because they are really passionate about it. So we get a wide variety of students demographically who come, and in terms of their backgrounds. So yeah, when Jim was in the mandolin orchestra, we had a guy from Manhattan, Kansas on bass. We had someone from Hickory, North Carolina. We had Sasan, who came from Iran. We had folks from all over. I had the great opportunity to work with Hiroshi Arakawa, who was a student from Japan, and he really got into the Mexican music. He was really into the Harana and to the son jarocho sound. So I think the folks in our program who might be a little bit more on the edge of things, who aren't right plugged into that mainstream bluegrass sound, they might be more interested in this kind of exploration. The same way that the mandolin orchestra was kind of like that as well. So I got to see these folks kind of come together, and that really has been exciting.
The group that came from somewhere in Eastern Europe last year or the year before, they had a cymbalum player.
Yeah, the Hungarian guys.
Hungarian guys, yeah. What was the name of the band?
Kapza.
Yeah. And how long were they here?
They were here for a year through a program funded by the Hungarian government. They just came, and we had this kick-butt group of Hungarian folk musicians in our program.
It was great.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And they one of them played a cymbalum, which is a version of a hammered dulcimer, which Jim knows very well. Yeah. And he could tear it up.
He was on it. Yeah, he's on it. And not too shabby musicians. Yeah. Have you been, or are you familiar with the Museum of Musical Instruments, the MIM in Phoenix, Arizona?
I've heard of it. I would love to go there. Look at me. I would love to go there.
That reminded we were there a couple of years ago, and it's a treasure trove. I mean, it's just stunning. They got instruments from every culture in the country, and not only that, you walk up to the display, and there's a video of the people who made the instruments playing the instruments. Yeah, it's very cool.
Well, it's exciting. I mean, the instruments can tell so many stories.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I've seen, definitely with the students who come to our program. Many of us, I think most of us, have relationships with our instruments. You can see I'm kind of a divided person, but we invest in these instruments. We hold them next to our bodies. We invest in them in time and in treasure, and we care for them. If they get wounded, it tears us up. And so I think trying different instruments and learning to use your instrument in a new way can really bring about some new insights and open up new kinds of conversations.
Anyone else have a question for Lee? Do we have any questions on YouTube tonight? No?
All right, quiet on the YouTube.
They're not as brave on YouTube as they are on Zoom sometimes.
Fair enough.
Well, this has been an amazing program. I am so glad that this is recorded. If anyone wants to come back to it, it will go up on our website in the next couple of weeks, so you can check it out there. And for those of you who are interested in the Musical Instrument Museum, they have some great social media videos that talk about some of those instruments. So definitely go check out their social media. It's well worth it. But this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Lee. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks, Renee.
You're welcome. Before we go, let me just grab my sheet. Tell you about a few things that are coming up at the museum in the next week or so or month or so that you might be interested in. Our next speaker sessions is on Tuesday, April 8th at 7 p.m. with songwriter Mary Munsey on the connections between songwriting and visual art making. That goes along very well with our current special exhibit, Ellen Elms, The Art of Music and Mountains, which just opened on the 8th of March and will be here through September 30th. So if you haven't had a chance to check out that exhibit, do that. And it actually connects really well to what you've been talking about tonight, Lee, because the 4 paintings on the back wall of the gallery are of the mandolin, the banjo, the fiddle, and the guitar. And she has taken those instruments and then dug deep into their connections to different cultures, different artists, different types of music within the colors and the symbolism and the pictures included in it. So it goes hand in hand with what you've been talking about. Thursday, March 13th at 7 p.m., so just a couple of days from now, we have Farm and Fun Time with Scott McMicken of Dr. Dog and Colby Helms. There's still a few tickets left, so be sure and grab those. Tuesday, March 18th at 2 p.m., we have a workshop with Rockwood Bookings Music Business Coaching, doing a course on music business. Saturday, March 22nd at 11:30 a.m., we have the Berea College Folk Roots Music Ensemble performance here, doing a free performance right after our Jam Musicians program. Saturday, March 22nd from 2 to 5 p.m., we also have our regular monthly Bluegrass Jam. You can either come and play or come and listen. And then finally, on Saturday, April 5th at 7 p.m., we have our second Square Dance of the year with Tyler Hughes as caller and John Bills leading the band. And that will be held at Bristol Ballet, who partners with us when we can't have square dances here at the museum. So those are some great programs. You can check those out on our website, birthplaceofcountrymusic.org, under the Events tab. And we hope to see you here for our next speaker sessions. But thank you again to Lee. Let's give him another round of applause.